the health factors, we have to start looking at food a little bit differently. I say we're waking up from our grocery store coma. That's what's happening right now. We're waking up from this coma of the only place I can get food is a grocery store. And that's just simply not true. And we're looking at our food, and I tell people you have to start thinking about this differently. If you have a can of peaches and you have a fresh peach, you have to look at that food and say, which of those is freshest? Well, if you're buying a peach in my climate in February, that means that peach has traveled how many hundreds or thousands of miles to get to the grocery store? So it's picked at a time when it's not completely ripe because it has to stay alive for it to get to me. Same thing with corn, same thing with potatoes. So really look at the food that your family is already eating and then start basing your planning of your pantry based on that food. And don't let it be overwhelming, like you have to do everything at once. Like pick one food that you know your family likes to eat. Start tracking how much of that food they eat every month. Or you could even do it in 3 months and then times it by 4. That would give you a whole year, right? And then you look at that and you say, how much of that do I need to get or do I need to plant in order to have that many ears of corn to feed my family for a whole year in order to do something like that? They're so simple to use. They're just intimidating because it's like driving a car for the first time. You're using a new piece of equipment. You know, you have to listen for those sounds and you have to know what you're looking at. So that's when you really want to heavily rely on people that do canning classes, your extension offices, your canning books, following people like me on TikTok, teaching what we do and showing you what, we're doing, and people that can help you answer questions when you get into a situation where you're like, hey, I don't know what to do with this.
Welcome to your journey to find true tranquility with the Tranquility Magazine podcast with your host, Jasmine Maya Royce. Today's episode featuring.
Today, I have the honor of having Sarah Thrush. Her first 3 years since she launched her TikTok channel, Heels and Petals, she has become one of the most widely viewed personality in the area of preserving. She is a go-to expert on safe and effective canning methods and a master creator of canning and preserving recipes that draw on tradition, but also are thoroughly contemporary and innovative. She is an in-demand expert on the subject and author of her newest book, Preserving with Purpose. She is also based in Michigan, and I'm so excited to have you today, Sarah. My first question is always, what is your current state of mind, your mantra?
My current state of mind as we're going into the fall and the winter season is to relax, turn in, tuck in, hibernate for the winter. As you know, we're just coming out of canning season. And so it's a really busy time of year for us. And so I'm really just looking forward to rejuvenating, getting back on track with myself and my family and our home, and making plans come spring to start the whole process all over again.
True. So in that, I'm assuming that you have your own garden, or are you canning from the store? So what kind of things, because you're in a certain zone where you're based. Do you know what zone you are?
Yeah, so I'm in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, which is a sometimes 5A, sometimes 4B, depending. We're like right on the line. So our grow season is extremely short up here. And so we grow a lot of our own foods right here on our property. But there's also a lot of foods that we can't grow. Either we don't have the soil for it, or we just don't have the amount of grow time needed for certain foods. So we like to do a combination of both. We grow a lot, but we also utilize our farmers markets and our local grocery stores as well to just try to get all the food that we're going to need for the winter, going into, again, the spring and the summer months when we start harvest all over again.
Yeah, from what I know, because we're based in Zone 9, you are not a citrus growing area or any kind of avocados that, Californians love. But the idea, there's certain particulars that you can only grow in the area that you are in, and what is the climate base that you can go off of.
A lot of brassicas up here and a lot of root vegetables. So we try to eat everything when it's in season and when it's available. So basically our cold hardy plants like our lettuces and spinach and broccoli and root vegetables, things like that make up a large portion of our diet in our house and in this area just because it's what's available for us to grow. It also stores really well over the wintertime. And so we have a lot of unique recipes and foods that we use up here in the extreme north to help make sure that we're just utilizing what we have available to us.
True. Root veg are important things to be aware of. And it makes sense because I've lived in different regions that makes it informative where you are and what grows there. And sometimes you have a shorter sun period and a more of a temperate and rain, frost, freeze, snow. All those are, acclimations that you have to make when you are having a garden. But kudos to you, because that is a lot of hard work going out there. I was raised with one, so I understand they're very beneficial. My dad is a horticulturist, so we were raised about having a garden and understanding those things. But preserving is a different factor because when you're talking about the longevity of food, so how did you get into learning and exploring preserving?
So I didn't have to really do a whole lot of exploring. I call myself a third generation canner, but this canning goes all the way back in my family. Like there's recipes in the book from the 1800s, which is at least 5, 6 generations ago. So this is how I grew up. I grew up in a very similar climate. And so it was part of my growing up. It wasn't anything that I really had to like go out and learn a new skill. It was just something that I can always remember doing. My youngest canning memory, I was probably like 7 or 8 when my mom let me help with the grape jelly from our grapevines. So yeah, I really didn't have a skill that I had to learn. It was just instilled in us because it was something that we always did.
Yeah, part of your roots, which also makes it very tapping into your bio saying traditional. So most people have lost this art or never been educated about it. I met someone recently that was so gung-ho about discovering preserving. She was just going crazy with it. But this is because it's a new experience and you're leading people in that direction to remember sustainability and how we used
to. Absolutely. And we all I always say environment dictates everything. Right? So our weather, our climate, our access to resources, all of those things dictate exactly what we can do with our food. And then you throw into the mix things like our cultures and our religions and how all of that is tied into our food. So to be able to share with people what my family does, I didn't, when I started making a video, it was just absolutely by happenstance that, I am where I am today, just based on a video that I decided to put out there. But there was a real need, I think, at that time, there was a real need, and there still is, for people to look at food a little bit differently and go, wow, I didn't realize I could do that myself, or I didn't realize I could grow that myself. Because we can grow all the food in the world, but if we don't have a way of preserving it, if we don't have a way of extending the shelf life of that food, then that food just ends up going to waste or a compost. And so we've really looked at it, I think, recently. And I say I just mean like a younger generation of people are coming up. And we, as the now incoming older generation, are like, hey, we need to teach these kids about these things. I'm 45, my youngest is 19, my oldest is 26. And there's a real need for it. People are really waking up and going, hey, I can do this myself. I can grow this myself. And there's a real want out there for people to learn how to do this. And that's really, really cool for me, for somebody that's always been doing it, because it was just such an easy thing for me to teach.
Yeah, it's important to understand. It's very topical right now for people figuring out a couple different things, affordability and waste. I have a hard time with wasting any kind of food and, figuring out different ways other than preserving as well as preserving, because it doesn't last that long. You go to the grocery store, you go to the farmer's market, you pick up things and they last for a time, and people get too fast paced, they forget about it. And then it's gone before you even used it.
I always say the most expensive food you'll ever buy is the food you throw away. Right? You might as well just open up your wallet and just stick it in the garbage can, because that's what you're doing. So again, food preservation, there's so many incredible benefits to it. And saving money is one of those, definitely.
Yeah, because you're also touching on a point that, I was raised in a way that we read labels. We look at everything that we buy that's already made, and we kind of dictate what's in it, what's the elements of it, and how good is your body to process these things. And can you explain about the health factors of preserving and why it's so important to kind of figure out for your gut and, microbiome, so to speak?
Yeah. So the very first thing is everything you put in a jar, you know exactly what's in it. So that's right off the bat. One of the things that really turns people on to preserving their own food. I think it's, no secret that we go to the grocery store, especially here in America, and you turn over the package and you start looking at the ingredients list and you're like, I can't pronounce half of this. And I think we're seeing that more and more and more. I also think, we're looking at foods and we're getting recalls on food. There's like 1,000 recalls out right now for salmonella and listeria and like all of these things. And people are really turning those packages over and they're looking at them and going, I don't know what this is. And I'm putting it in my body every single day. So that is one of the benefits to canning. Every single thing that goes in the jar is there by your making and by your hands. So you know exactly what's going into it. Also, the health factors. We have to start looking at food a little bit differently. I say we're waking up from our grocery store coma. That's what's happening right now. We're waking up from this coma of the only place I can get food is a grocery store. And that's just simply not true. And we're looking at our food, and I tell people you have to start thinking about this differently. If you have a can of peaches and you have a fresh peach, you have to look at that food and say, which of those is freshest? Well, if you're buying a peach in my climate in February, that means that peach has traveled how many hundreds or thousands of miles to get to the grocery store. So it's picked at a time when it's not completely ripe because it has to stay alive for it to get to me, right? So when you pick a fruit or a vegetable off the vine before it is fully formed, you're not getting the dense nutrients that you would if you picked it off the vine and ate it that day. So if I'm buying that raw peach in February, or I'm buying a jar or a can of peaches that were picked from the farmer, flash frozen, or canned in the same day, the things that have been preserved are actually more nutrient dense and fresher for you than the raw peach. And we haven't been taught to look at our food in those terms. We haven't been taught that the closer you are to grabbing that fruit off the vine and putting it in your body, the more nutrition you're going to get. And so when you preserve your food, when you can your food, you are literally pulling things off the vine at their fresh peakness, or maybe you're getting it from your farmer's market. That's fresh peakness. It hasn't had to travel hundreds of thousands of miles to get to you. And then you're pausing the food. You're pausing deterioration of the food and you're preserving it and putting it in the jar. I think that's why people are looking into food preservation and why we're finally waking up and we're looking at our grocery store foods and going, oh my gosh, this probably isn't good for me.
Yes, I mean, you nailed the point and you brought up a couple different topics in there to people's awareness. We used to call it a locavore. A locavore meaning people that would eat where your climate is from, because you're also touching on exportation and importation of food, because however far out of your area that food has traveled by has been picked way earlier than it's ripened by. They also either spray it with some kind of acceleration to get it looking ripe, because it's not really ripened when they pick it, to transport all the way to a different area that you don't have that accessible fruit at that time, like the peach. I have already kind of explored those ideas, but then you were touching on another concept that's not just about, locavore, but a seasonalvore. So you understand the seasons, that is important, because if you're getting something not really in your area, but outside of your area and outside the time of the area. So if you want, a blackberry and we're in the northern hemisphere, a, blueberry in the middle of winter, you're not really going to find something that has been grown here and it doesn't really taste the same. It kind of tastes bitter and unripened because it's transported from somewhere else. These are good ideas.
It's all about eating not only locally, but seasonally. If I go to where you're at in California, there's going to be avocados, there's going to be citrus, there's going to be, all of these things that for me is not going to ever grow where I live, ever. I'm technically if we're looking at how we are, intermingled with the earth, I'm technically not supposed to eat those foods, right?
Mhm.
Those foods are not for me. If I were to live, 300, 400, 500 years ago where we weren't like traveling around in cars all the time, and
Mhm.
I'm supposed to eat the food that's in my area.
Mhm.
And you talked about your gut health and stuff like that. That stuff was all directly related to where you lived and what your culture of what your food was. And we've really gotten away from that because now I can eat a pineapple in February if I want to, where
Mhm.
before I wouldn't know what a pineapple was.
Yeah, I mean, they did a lot of studies recently about, your genetic makeup, so to speak,
Yeah.
where people process foods differently because of their upbringing and their history, related to a certain, you were more root veg orientated. And then we have summer here far too long. We don't like in Southern California, we don't have seasons really. We have cute seasons. And so in
Yeah.
that we have a lot of citrus and a lot of vitamin D focused foods, and we have more of that plethora available to us here, whereas where you are more the carrots, potatoes, beets that I love, things like that are more,
Rutabagas,
yeah, rutabagas.
turnips. Yeah.
They're available there more because they're hardy and they can
Hmm.
sustain after a freeze, or they can last for far longer than our non-delicate weather. But in that, so what is your first or favorite kind of concept that you go into canning when you start your process for, in the fall season is part of canning. So,
Yeah, so for us, I look at everything as we should be eating what we can and canning what we eat. So I need to just take what my family, and this is what I tell people that are just starting off in canning or gardening or food preservation. You shouldn't really be, unless it's just fun for you, trying to grow or learn how to can something that your family is never going to eat, right? So you want to take a look at your family's diet. And I can tell you how many jars of corn we eat every year, how many jars of carrots we eat every year. And then I know how much of that food to either plant or get from my farmers to make sure that that happens. I don't buy, let's take carrots, for example. I don't buy carrots once a month on my grocery shopping list. That just does not happen. Yeah, I'm just not going to do that. That's not how my pantry is run. That's not how we cook. So I grow enough carrots that way when I do a carrot harvest, I'm harvesting and I'm preserving 2 bushels of carrots because 2 bushels of carrots will take us all the way until the next carrot season. And when you start doing that, when you start looking at how much is my family eating, then you know how much of that food to preserve. In
mm,
the long run, that saves you thousands. We save anywhere between $8,000 and $10,000 a year in our grocery bill because I don't have to run out to the store to buy carrots ever.
mhm,
Same thing with corn, same thing with potatoes. So really look at the food that your family is already eating and then start basing your planning of your pantry based on that food. And don't let it be overwhelming like you have to do everything at once. Like pick one food that you know your family likes to eat. Start tracking how much of that food they eat every month. Or you could even do it in 3 months and then times it by 4. That would give you a whole year, right? And then
mhm.
you look at that and you say, how much of that do I need to get or do I need to plant in order to have that many ears of corn to feed my family for a whole year? And then once you do that one food, then do 2 foods, then do 3 foods. And before you know it, you have a completely stocked pantry. It happens really, really fast. And you can really start to save a lot of money that way. And you're eating better.
Yeah, I mean, it's important for, having those things on demand that, especially you've been in the position being a mom, it's you're so frantic and trying to do everything
Yeah,
at once, and you need something to, you don't feel like cooking right now and everybody's
right.
hungry. And so how do you figure out a setting aside food that you have kind of on demand when you need it because you don't really have a multitude of time, but you have moments
Right.
where you can do these things?
Yeah, so it saves you a ton of time. I'm not going to say it's not a labor of love because it is, right?
Mhm.
And it does take time to do this and to start it. It does. But like my family likes zuppa toscana. It's one of their favorite soups. We go through it a lot.
Mhm.
So I take my zuppa toscana recipe and I make a huge batch of it, enough to fill 12 quart jars at a time, or 14 quart jars at a time, I should say. And we'll eat some of it that night, and then the rest of it will go in the canner. And then
Mhm.
that goes on the shelf. And then my next 12 to 14 Zuppa Toscana meals are already cooked and done. So I'm only making it once and then I'm batch canning it up. So that saves me 12, at least 1 hour episodes in my kitchen. That saves me 12 hours in the long run. Plus my family can go and grab that jar of soup and have that anytime they want. So instead of saying, hey, can you stop and pick up McDonald's or can you stop and get, whatever? No, go, there's Zuppa Toscana in there, and so
Yeah.
they don't even ask anymore. They'll just go grab something. So now our like eat out or a fast food, it really becomes like maybe once every couple of months, one of the kids will call me and say, hey, if you're out, is it okay if we get some French fries or something? I mean, it's just not a thing for us. We batch cook everything. It saves us time. It saves us money. And then I don't have to think about cooking dinner every night either, which is a total blessing.
Yeah, it's important for saving time. And then what you're saying is batch cooking, making sure you
Yeah.
have a plethora. I always jokingly say that I cook like an Italian mother, that I'm making meals for 1,000 people, but it's just me for the most part.
Right.
And I was like, okay, I got it. But, so you're talking about your soup. Does your Toscana have meat in it? Or is
Yeah.
it,
It
okay,
has a Italian sausage, like the spicy Italian sausage. Yep, it's just the basics for it's your potatoes, it's your kale, or if you spinach or it's just your basics and it's just a soup starter and you just open it, add your heavy cream to it when you're reheating it and it's
yes.
delicious.
So part of that in the understanding that we do from my family, we do some of these, but I hadn't got into meat. And this is the thing that I was reticent about, because you never really want to give anyone that's anything that's meat about preserving it right, because it can have a very bad expiration date and you were giving somebody something. So when you go about that, how do you use a specific canning operation, timing, or device?
Yeah, so you have two basic types of canning. You have water bath canning and pressure canning. Now that's here in North America. There are a lot of countries that do things extremely different, right? There's over 160 agencies in the globe that all has some type of recommendations of how they do things in their country or even their state. In the United States, every state has its own local extension office, which they don't always talk to each other either. So sometimes they have conflicting information from state to state. So what you really want to do is you want to have yourself a good, steady source of information. And then you want to double check that 2, 3, 4 times. So when you have these two types of canning methods, you have to decide which method is appropriate for that food. And so to do that, you have to know the acidity of the food. And all of these things are what these agencies kind of help lay out for everybody. That's why you can do peaches in a water bath canner. But if you're doing something like beans or meat, like you're talking about, that would go on a pressure canner. So here in North America, those are the two main types. The food dictates the process. So the food decides which type of process it needs to be done. And then you follow the time charts and you follow the instructions for that specific food. So all the heavy lifting has really been done for us in this country. In a lot of other countries that have these agencies, the heavy lifting's kind of been done because it's the same process all the time. So it doesn't matter if I'm doing chicken or beef, or tonight I'm doing venison because it's hunting season right now. We're canning venison. Those meat times and that instructional process is exactly the same no matter what.
Yeah, I think it's important to know the difference between two and kind of how to preserve it right. But also, when you're talking about pressure canning, I learned in the experience of understanding the actual gauge. Now they have digital gauge. Do you do a digital or do you do the old-fashioned gauge that you have to be accurately gauged to make sure that it's working appropriately? They have someone that does that.
So I use what you're talking about is like the manual canner, like an original pressure canner. Those are what I use. My mother has what you're talking about, an electric canner, and she loves hers because it's really for small batches. You can't get very many jars in those. And she loves hers because it's just her and my dad. So it just makes sense, for her to just can up what they need for their food. However, I will say there's pros and cons to both. One of the pros with using a manual canner is that you are in complete and absolute control of that canner the entire time. That means that the weights that you're talking about, the gauge that goes up and down and the weights, I'm in charge of that. So when that weight starts to jiggle, I know I have achieved pressure. With an electric canner, you are relying on a computer circuit board to do the whole thing for you. So if at any time in that process that circuit board malfunctions or the pressure in the canner goes down and you're just blissfully unaware of it, right? That means you have no control over that and you may not even know that that's happened. So there is some arguments right now going on between the extension offices and the USDA and the FDA, all trying to decide if these electric pressure canners are safe to use. Yeah, it's a big, long process of trying to get those approved. And there's really only one on the market right now. It only has half the approval, but not the other half. So I tell people, always do your research, always know the equipment you're using, how it is supposed to function, and how to troubleshoot that if something were to go wrong with that. Because you absolutely want to make sure that your food is safe that's on the shelves.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're talking about the traditional method, which I'm more familiar with. I haven't done the digital, so I'm ignorant in that one. But I also understand that when you're doing something pressure canning, you're saying you're in control. Can you expand upon that because of the time that it takes kind of to observe?
Sure. What I mean is you are in control of the canner because you are regulating the heat. So pressure is created in a pressure canner by creating steam heat. So basically you have just a little bit of water in the canner. You turn the heat on and the canner fills up with steam. You then put a weight on top of the vent pipe and that blocks the steam from coming out. And when steam gets blocked, it starts to compress and it starts to create pressure. So I can control that whole thing with the stove dial, basically. Turn the heat up, turn the heat down. I control it. I keep an eye on it. I can hear the gauge jiggling when it reaches pressure. And that's what I mean by I'm in control. When you're using an electric canner, you can really just push the on button, and that's really the only control that you have over that canner.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to understand that the time of awareness that you have to be fully present for watching a traditional canner. Tea, I drink tea all the time. So it's kind of like hearing, the kettle boring,
Yes.
you're kind of at that point that, it's time to kind of regulate.
Yeah.
Most of them
Yep.
have like a little alert system. If you have a great ear, you're like, okay, it's my time to pay attention and sit with
After you've been doing it a long time, it's like that. Like you recognize the sound, right? So I can have 2, 3, 4 canners going at the same time. Each canner will sound different depending on what burner it's on. I can go about cleaning my house and folding my laundry and doing stuff because I've been doing this for a while. So I can listen for those sounds and hear it. I think people get really scared of the pressure canners. Well, there's a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons is everybody is always afraid those things are going to blow up. It's no secret. You go on Facebook and about every 6 months, there's a photo of like a canner in the ceiling or something. And those pictures, they recirculate like every 6 months and they're never anything new. But I tell people you have to be willfully negligent to get one of those things. I mean, there are so many safety features on them. And if you are just following the manual and following the steps and, following your canning guides, there's no physical possible way to do that. You have to not put the water in it. You have to turn the heat all the way to high. Then you have to get in the car, go to the grocery store, do your grocery shopping, come home, mow the lawn, never check the canner. I mean, that's what I mean by like willful negligence in order to do something like that. They're so simple to use. They're just intimidating because it's like driving a car for the first time. You're using a new piece of equipment. You have to listen for those sounds and you have to know what you're looking at. So that's when you really want to heavily rely on people that do canning classes, your extension offices, your canning books, following people like me on TikTok or Instagram that are always just teaching what we do and showing you what, we're doing, and people that can help you answer questions when you get into a situation where you're like, hey, I don't know what to do with this.
Yeah, it's a good resource to understand, knowing a different community to ask questions. And you are very right. You have to be very much negligent of what you're doing. You left your thing around unattended, unsupervised, and do whatever you're doing without earshot, or you have bad hearing, so to speak, which can happen. But you have to be kind of observant of it if you want to take care of it. But if you don't, you're kind of a rarity moment that you would have something like that happen.
Yeah. But I tell people it's like driving a car, right? If you are the only one on the road for hundreds of miles around and you wreck the car, you were in control of that car, right? So it's kind of like that. You are in control of the canner, and that's why I like the manual canners, because I'm in complete control of that canner the whole time that it's running.
Yeah, it's important to understand that you need to be aware for it. And the results are better. Everything we call canning is an art form. So make sure that
Yeah.
some of the people that get into canning are wanting to give gifts, or you have so much food that you give it away, or it's like a holiday gift or something like
Right.
that. It's good to share in that, but also you want to make sure that you're giving something away that's healthy and
Yeah.
also not going to make anything sick or anyone sick. But in that, like, I learned a couple things about, soups per se when we're talking about pressure canning. So seasoning wise, you want to expand about the difference between canning and normal cooking.
Sure. So
Mhm.
I tell people when you first start canning, you have to take off your cook's hat, your chef's hat, and you have to put on your canning hat. So
Mhm.
it's a little bit of a different process, right? So in our kitchens, we can heat things to basically boiling water temperatures. 212 degrees ish is where our water bath canning is. But when we get into pressure canning, what we're doing is we're putting all of the spices under pressure. And so on a cellular level, what happens is the outside shell of the spices kind of burst, and it gives you these huge, intense flavors. And so when you start canning, first of all, you use your recipe books. Those people have already done all the canning and they've said, you know what, for an average palate, this is good. Start here. But if you're expanding and you're getting into your own recipes, you really need to scale back on the spices, because the end product after it's been canned might be slightly different than what your cook's brain is used to. It might be slightly more salty or slightly, it just have a more intense flavor to it. So just scale back on the spices a little bit. There is one spice for certain you don't want to use in canning, and that is sage. Sage can become terribly, terribly bitter, like horribly bitter when you're canning. So if you have a recipe that calls for sage, or a recipe that calls for something that you're not sure if you can use it in canning, just leave the seasoning out. You're
Mhm.
going to reheat the jar anyway when you're preparing the meal or you're, getting ready to eat it. Just go ahead and add those seasonings back to the jar or back to the pot when you're reheating. And then that way you don't have to worry about wasting any of your food.
Yeah, I mean, I had to learn that because I do love seasonings, and I had to scale back when I got into developing my soup level of canning, and then
Yeah.
realizing that, can't have those seasonings in there because it will change the taste of the food, and it's also
Yeah.
awful. Sage is a very prime example of
One
that.
of my dearest friends, she has been struggling with her chili recipe for like 2 years. And I think at this point she's finally like given up. She's like, I just can't, she can't get it replicated perfectly in the
Hmm.
canning jar as to what her family is used to eating. And I think it's only off to her. I think she's the only one that would probably notice, but it's just not perfectly right. So she's like, I think she's done with it now.
I mean, it's hard, because it's not the
Yeah.
same thing over time. It takes, I have
Yeah.
like 4 or 5 soups that I always make, and sometimes they don't translate well when I'm,
Right.
figuring out canning. It's like, okay, because it's kind of all by taste, because that's my chef's hat, putting it on to taste something, and then it's
Right.
halfway in the zone of being finished, because I always think that in my mind when you're canning it, it's halfway finished. It's not all the way finished, but it's kind of at that halfway point that I need to stop like myself from doing what I would
Stop
do.
the seasonings. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
control,
having
control.
said that, I'm a huge advocate for small batch canning. So
Hmm.
if you're just starting off or you're using a new recipe for the very first time, do it in a small batch. There's nothing wrong with just doing 4 jars. You don't have to fill up the entire canner every single time. So do a small batch. And then I tell people try it the day of after you're done canning it. Try it like a week later and a month later and see if you
Hmm.
still like the same thing. It's okay to can a recipe and go, I'm not canning that again. Like my family didn't eat it or we didn't like it. That's fine. I don't want that to stop you from canning. It just means that you didn't like that recipe and maybe there's a better one out there for you. So I'm a huge advocate. Start small, and then once you nail that recipe, once you get it exactly the way you want it, just replicate it over and over and over again.
Amazing. So there is a couple things that I want you to kind of explain to people that
Sure.
haven't been canning before, especially about salt, cleaning, and preparing for the canning journey, and what you recommend for a couple ingredients that you have to have with you.
Okay, so if you get the book, Preserving with a Purpose, the first 4 chapters are like super basics. super basics. Also, the canning conundrums is in there. So a couple of the things you're talking about, let's start with the cleaning of the jars and the cleaning of the equipment. There are, again, two types of canning that we talk about in the book, the water bath and the pressure canning. The water bath canning is going to require you to heat all of your jars or boil all of your jars. But pressure canning is not always that way. So in pressure canning, you can have something called cold packing, which means putting room temperature food or cold food in the jars. And so in that case, the jars don't need to be heated. What I will say is you must start with everything clean. And so everything needs to be washed with hot soapy water and rinsed, whether you're heating the jars for hot packing or the jars are room temperature for cold packing. So in either one of those instances, every time you start this process, you want to make sure you have clean jars, clean rings for your jars, and clean flats or lids for the jars. You also want to make sure your canners are clean, your jar lifters, any of your accessory equipment. You want to make sure all that stuff is really washed really well. As far as heating the jars go, the only reason we heat a jar is for thermal shock. That's it. So there's this misnomer in the canning community that started back in the 40s and the 50s, and we've kind of just carried this on from generation to generation. You need to sterilize your jars. Mm-hmm. Well, you actually cannot sterilize a jar, not in a home kitchen because it's not a sterile environment. So the minute you take those jars out of boiling water or out of your oven and they hit the air, they hit the ambient air, the air has microbes in it and that jar is no longer sterile. And so what you want, again, start with clean, hot, soapy, washed off jars. You want them clean. As far as sterilizing them, unfortunately, we can't. We can sanitize them. You want them sanitized, but we can't sterilize them. So that's the hot jars thing. The second question about salt, I think you're talking about, people look at canning sometimes and they're like, oh my gosh, there's probably all that salt and all that food or all that vinegar. I hear that one too. Mm-hmm. And that's simply not the case. The only time we use vinegar is when you're pickling something. Mm-hmm. That's actually the brine. That's the pickling brine has vinegar. And none of these foods that you see here, these have all been pressure canned. Not a single one of them requires salt. Salt is optional. Salt is always for flavor. The only time salt isn't for flavor is if you're curing a meat in salt. Mm-hmm. Then you would have to have that salt to cure the meat. But all of these, not a single one of them have salt in them. So you get to choose if you want salt or not. It's just for flavor.
There's also a different salt for canning.
Yes and no.
Okay.
So there is something called a canning salt. And you can use that if you want your jars crystal clear. So what that means is when you have a liquid like these green beans right here, mm-hmm. These green beans have a liquid in them. And if I wanted to add salt to that jar and I use a table salt, the table salt has some anti-caking agents in them. And so those can get cloudy in the jar. It does not affect safety. Your choice of the salt you want to use in canning is completely up to you. So you can use table salt, you could use canning salt, you could use Himalayan pink salt if that's what you like. But the liquid itself might not be crystal clear if you use something other than canning salt. It's the same thing with vinegars. There will be a specific canning vinegar. And what that means is it's a 5% acidity. But you can use any vinegar you want as long as you know how to get that vinegar to 5%.
Yeah, I think it's important to understand the difference in kind of some additives that you need to have or want to have. And then mm-hmm. The resource is important. Having a book
and
that
I
will
think
teach you.
It's super easy when you start with the recipe. So mm-hmm. Find the book, find the recipe, and be like, that's the thing I want to do. And then base your canning supplies off of that. That is the easiest way to go. If you go into it and you're like, because it's going to be overwhelming. You're like, I don't know what spices I need. I don't know what equipment I need. If you start with the book, if you start with the resource, then you know what you're going to need for every single one of those recipes. And they're repeat things, right? So if you want to get into pickling, you're going to find the pickling spices repeat themselves over and over and over again,
yeah. I mean, I'm an advocate for vinegar because it's good for your gut, but that's everybody's individual taste. People don't like the taste of vinegar, and that's part of it too.
My husband loves pickled meat. Mm-hmm. I am not a pickled meat person, but I make him pickled meat. like we all have our things. So,
You have your caveats that you need. So I always ask the last two questions. One is what is the best advice you've ever received?
best advice I've ever received is to not be so hard on myself that I'm afraid of failing. Like, don't not start something because you're afraid of failing. My mother would tell me all the time, you're going to fail. You're going to fail in life. You're going to screw up. Sometimes it hurts, physically. Sometimes it hurts financially, but it's going to happen. Don't not start the thing because you're afraid of failing. Like, just go into it knowing, hey, I might fail at this. And that's always kind of stuck with me through my life, is that when I want something, I just go for it. I'm a flying leap off the cliff kind of person because I see something that I want. And I'm very blessed in the fact that I had somebody in my life helping raise me that would support me every single time I fell. I hope everybody out there has somebody like that in your life that will just catch you when you fall and that you just go for it. Just go for it and know that you might fail, and that's okay.
Well, that's good because it always touches on my last question is what would you learn from the hardest decision you had to make or the biggest failure for you?
Don't can sausage with sage in it. I mean, that's not my hugest failure, but just as a funny closing story, I bought 50 pounds of sausage, like real good organic from the pig farmer sausage. And I didn't know that they had already pre-spiced it with all the sage, and I canned it all. And it was all garbage. The best thing I took away from the biggest failure is, none of us are getting out of here alive. Not a single one of us. Mm-hmm. So unless your failure was big enough to put you a few feet under the ground, it's all right. You're going to make it. There'll be more failures in the future. It's okay. Pick yourself up, dust yourself off, have your cry if you need to, but just keep going and try it again. Try it again.
Mm-hmm. Wise words. It's important to understand that we only got one journey right now, and this is the journey you're on. If you're willing to try and you experimented and you failed, you're still alive and kicking. So continue on your journey. Better maybe for next time. But yes,
right. Exactly.
Thank you very much. Sarah Thrush has her new book up, Preserving with Purpose. She is a great resource if you're starting out your canning journey. You can find her details below to find her TikTok channel, Peels and Petals, and also she's becoming widely known in also the social media network for her abilities and her experience in the canning and preserving methods. Thank you very much, Sarah, for your time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for tuning in to the Tranquility Magazine podcast. Please subscribe and add your questions to our Q&A. We want to give a thank you to our team for their effort in creating every episode and our content at tranquilitymagazine.com.